Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming along this morning, and thank you to Deborah for inviting me and for the faculty for inviting me too. This is one of my favourite topics of all time, so if I can have any opportunity to talk about, I call it the negotiated curriculum. I'm very happy to take it, and I loved hearing the introduction about Murray Ray. Is it Murray Ray? I think if you have a little tiny rebellious bone in your body, or maybe a few of those, I think you'll enjoy today's discussion. And I think Murray Ray, if she was here, hopefully she would enjoy it as well. It does sometimes make people feel a little bit uncomfortable, so I'll just warn you about that to start with. I won't ask you to do anything embarrassing or role plays up the front or anything. But it does sometimes cause, even me, I've done it for a while, and it still causes me some angst every now and again, because there's a bit of a loss of control associated, as Grady and I were just talking about. Sometimes you have to let go a little bit more than we're used to. So I just thought I'd mention to you, I'm from an education discipline background, and I have for many years in my university career since the 90s, I've always had some connection with an arts faculty, as a result I'm often on their discussion lists and their email lists, so I sort of have my heart in education and in arts. The other thing I should mention to you, that theoretically I suppose you would call me a social constructivist. That's the background I work from, and a lot of my research methods would be considered participatory methods. So I really like getting stakeholders involved in my research, which is some of the research I'll share with you today. And the other thing I should tell you about is my idea of learning at university. I went to a conference a few years ago in the UK, and I pinched this metaphor from the guest speaker there. And he said that he tells his students when they come to university, he said, don't expect it to be a hotel. You're not coming here to get your nails painted, metaphorically, and sit back and have everybody pander to you and bring you things. He said, don't think of our university as a hotel. Think of it as a gym. You've got to work damn hard, and it's not easy. And sometimes you'll hate me as the gym instructor. He said, we're here to metaphorically wipe your brow and, suggest that you try that machine or don't go on that one because it's too strenuous. But it's not a hotel. So that's where I'm coming from with my students, and I tell them that up front, in week one, whether they're online or studying by distance. So I'd also like to acknowledge quite a lot of my colleagues that I've worked with at Avondale. Avondale's a small place, a small college just north of Sydney, and as of yesterday, TEXA have announced that we're now a university college, so that's very exciting for us, which means we're on, thank you. Yeah, there were great celebrations up there yesterday. It's a culmination of years and years of work, and we're now on track to becoming a university within 5 years. So that's very exciting. I'm not even sure what we're called at the moment, but as of last Friday, we were Avondale College of Higher Education, and I'll have to find out when I go back home to work out what we are now. So all these people are some of the ones I've worked with, and to be honest, I don't think I do much individual research anymore. I tend to work in teams or partners. So a lot of these people here have worked with me on some of the projects that I'll tell you about today. And the other thing I'd like to mention is this great little group called Tattle. Can you just raise your hand if you know anything about Tattle or if you're in a Tattle group? And as you can see, it stands for Talking About Teaching and Learning. And this is part of HERDSA, and I was lucky to become a Tattler, or part of Tattle, back in 2011. And up until that stage, I'd done my PhD in higher education university teaching and my master's in online learning. And I thought I was a pretty good reflective practitioner, but it wasn't until I joined Tattle that I really deepened my reflection about my teaching and learning. And I felt like I reached a higher level of thinking about my teaching. And the other thing that Tattle does, it's very collaborative. So I'm very engaged with this idea of collaborative reflective practice. And Robert Keneally, who's here today, I'll just point you out there, Robert. Robert Keneally and Coralie McCormack were the leaders of Tattle, the initiators of it. So I'd like to acknowledge them as well. All right, so today there's few things I'd like to share with you, not necessarily in that order, it'll be a bit mixed up, but I thought I'd start off with just a few definitions of the negotiated curriculum, and then how it's done, why it's done, and some recommendations for practice. So the recommendations for practice will be sprinkled through, but just to give you a couple of very small examples of what it is, in case people are wondering, what on earth am I talking about? A few years ago, one of my nieces, she was in primary school at the time, this is a long time ago, in the early 2000s, one of her teachers gave the class a little project, and Tia, my niece, said, "Can I do my project in PowerPoint?" And the teacher, to her credit, said, instead of saying no, she said, "What is PowerPoint?" So she found out what it was, and Tia was only 8, and she said, "Yes, I think you can do that." So that was a tiny example, I think, of the negotiated curriculum when it worked. Another example when it didn't work is me in my master's degree. I was just about to submit my thesis, a couple of days away, and I had this absolute brainwave, probably fueled by lack of sleep and craziness at the end of a thesis. And I thought, this isn't a book, this doesn't need pages, this thing's a website. So the 2 days before my thesis was due, I thought, I'm going to create a website for this. This is 2001. I didn't really know how to make a website, but I used some clunky, horrible process. I forget what the software was. And I stayed up all night and I created this website, and I handed in my thesis a few days later as a book, as it was in those days, a whole lot of papers, and a CD, thinking the university should take my recommendation and take it as a CD. They said no, but they accepted the idea that it could be done in the future. And I think sometimes now people even hand their thesis in as a hyperlinked document. So there are a few of the ideas. So in terms of what the negotiated curriculum is, essentially it's engaging students with making decisions about curriculum design and assessment design. It could be other things as well. But for this discussion this morning, I'd just like to throw a few ideas up on the board, up on the screen, and encourage you to think, well, I wonder if there are any other words there that I've missed. Yeah, look, essentially I think what it is for today anyway, these two things, students and lecturers, whether you call yourself teachers, you could be an instructional designer, an educational developer, a course designer, working together in partnership to make decisions on curriculum and assessment. And David Bowd made a call for us all a few years ago. He said, look, it's great that you get students involved in feedback for their assignments, and it's great that we're involving students and asking them for feedback about the course, the whole course. But we need to do more. We need to go right back to the beginning of the design stage when we're thinking about what are we going to teach, even where we're going to teach it. Whether you choose a room like this or a different sort of room, whether you teach outside, whether you go out into the community. These sorts of decisions, he says, and others say as well, are things that we should be thinking about. However, this is the difficult bit. Some people have fears about this, some people have concerns. There's a podcast I listened to recently, I'll tell you about it soon, called Fast Track Impact, and the guy on that said, Mark Reed from the University of Newcastle Newcastle University in the UK, and he says, hang on a second, we're the ones with the PhDs. Like, what are we inviting students into this process for? This is a bit weird. So there are fears, concerns, as well as excitement associated with this topic. So I'm going to stop talking just for a little while and ask you to yell out any fears, interests, concerns that you might have about the negotiated curriculum. And I won't take offence if you say anything negative. So feel free to yell out anything, the good, the bad, the ugly. Doubt. Thanks, Catherine. Sorry? Judgment. Time consuming. I'm just repeating them so that you can hear them. Yeah, so it runs against a lot of our QA processes. It definitely happened in some of the projects we did. Yeah. Moderation, thanks. Tom?
Will students be genuine?
Will they be genuine? Good question.
What will the minister say?
What will the minister say? What will the Vice-Chancellor say? What will my Dean say? What will the people sitting on my promotion panel say? All these sorts of questions. What will the students say? You know, I was in a lecture a few years ago, and one of my students put her hand up, and I had tutors in the room as well who were working for me. And one of the students said, "Maria, have you heard of this new resource about the Australian curriculum?" And it was a resource I hadn't heard of. And I said, "No." I said, "Stand up and tell us about it." And later on, one of the tutors said to me, "Oh my God, Maria, that was so embarrassing." I said, "What was embarrassing?" And she said, "You didn't know what she was talking about." And I said, "No, I didn't. I had never heard of that resource." And she said, "I really felt for you." And I thought, okay, what we've got there is a clash of conceptions of teaching. So I think that's sort of at the base of a lot of these ideas. But we do have, I didn't have to look far for this blog. You know, this fear of loss of control, and it's a real thing because sometimes students have fantastic ideas about what we could do in the curriculum. They have great ideas on how to solve things. But you know what? Sometimes they have really not so good ideas. And so part of this negotiated curriculum is negotiating and educating students. So I'm going to just go through a few examples now, little examples, before I launch into 3 of the research projects that we've used for this topic. And the examples I have come from different levels of education. And one of the best proponents of the negotiated curriculum, you probably already know this, are early childhood teachers. So I'm going to borrow some of their ideas as well. The first one, though, is from higher education. This is my colleague Peter Kilgour at Avondale. And a few years ago he had a problem. He had 4th year education students. They were pretty well versed in teaching by then. They were being paid. They were going out to schools teaching, and he had to teach them a unit in the final year of their semester. They didn't want to come on campus, they were busy. So he ran an online group and he put students in charge of every week on an online forum. So one student led one week with 6 others in their group, the next student led the next week. So the students had to choose a topic within the boundaries of the unit. They had to research it, they had to facilitate the activity, then they had to summarise it, send a report to Peter, evaluate themselves and evaluate their peers. So that was one of their assignments. Now Peter, it actually worked well, so each of the students were working as teachers, or students as teachers. That was one little example. So that's a tick, that's a success story. This next one was, Grady, you may remember Sue Cox at ECU. Sue was working with us in the Faculty of Education, and she was also working part-time as a Year 1 teacher. So she had this bunch of, not that bunch, but a bunch like that, of Year 1s, and Sue used the negotiated curriculum. All around her room, she had learning outcomes up on the wall in student-friendly language, and the students were getting to the point where they would say to her, "Miss Cox, I can do that now. I reckon I can do that." And she would say, "Show me." And sometimes she would say, "You know what, I agree with you. I think you've achieved that learning outcome." And this is the language she would use with 6-year-olds. And sometimes she would say, "I think you're almost there, but I'd like to see you doing that a little bit more in a few other contexts." So that one was a good example. Another one from education was a student of mine I had a few years ago, Conno, and he ended up in a prac classroom for 8 weeks with a teacher who used 100% negotiated curriculum. Now this woman knew the curriculum inside out. She knew what they should have been doing in all the different learning areas, but she listened to the students. Some people call these people curriculum whisperers. You know, they've got the ear to the ground, they're listening to see what are the students interested in, and I think we can do that in higher ed. So one day Conno found out that the 4-year-olds he was teaching, a lot of them had never been on a bus. They were watching the bus come into the schoolyard, but a lot of them were getting dropped off by their parents. So Conno rang the local bus company and said, "Would you like us to wash your bus?" And he got the bus driver out, the bus came to the school, the kids crawled all over the bus, they went for a ride on the bus, they washed it, and then when he left, they sent him letters afterwards and said, "Look, we really liked doing that." Then they measured the bus and wrote stories about it. But they said, "We've got some suggestions for you, Mr. Bus Driver. We quite like your bus, but you know what? All the seats are exactly the same, and we think that you should modify them and, change them up a bit and make it more interesting for the children. So they sent that off, and they had this confidence in them that someone is listening to them. The bus driver did listen. I think he tied ribbons to the seats the next time he used the bus. My sister's an early childhood teacher, again borrowing from early childhood. The students in her class, in her centre, they're very interested in the Aboriginal culture. In their classroom they have the Torres Strait Islander flag, the Aboriginal flag, the Australian flag. And recently, I don't know if it's still the case, they saw some event on TV and they saw that the Harbour Bridge had 2 Australian flags. And they said to my sister Monique, Neek, why is it that there's only 2 Australian flags on the Harbour Bridge? Did the other flags fall off? Like, what happened to them? Did they lose them? And Monique said, look, I don't know. And they decided that they wanted to write a letter to ScoMo. So hopefully it's arrived down the road here. And they're waiting for a response, I tell you. They're waiting for that. So I hope they get some sort of response. But these are the sorts of activities I think other teachers do, where they sometimes throw their plans out for the day and they incorporate the children's interests or the students' interests. All right, the next one. This is a disaster one. This is me. So a few years ago, back when I was at ECU, I had a group of 4th year students and I thought they were going pretty well. And I thought they were at the stage where they could write their own rubric. So I gave them a couple of learning outcomes and 1 or 2 criteria in the rubric that had to be there. And I said to them, I want you for your assignment to write your own rubric, break down these learning outcomes and fill in the rubric, the empty cells that I gave them. Well, this is what I was faced with. Many students looking like that. They were not happy with me. The task was just too open-ended, and one of the key things with the negotiated curriculum is I hadn't prepared them. So I hadn't said to them, look, in a few weeks' time I'm going to ask you to do this really tricky thing. So I didn't tell them that this was coming up, and I didn't really think about the skills that they needed. I over-assumed their knowledge. So, ba-bong, bad one for me. The next example I'll give you is also from Western Australia. There's a school there called Bold Park. They're bold in nature and in name, and they cater for 18-month children through to 18-year-olds. And the students of that school are absolutely involved in the curriculum. They make decisions about what's being taught with their teachers and their parents and the community. They make decisions about how it's going to be taught and even where it's going to be taught. So they sometimes have lessons, as you can see here, out in the community. I had a group of second years a few years ago and they were just tired of being inside. And we were doing a maths activity, flying planes. They had to create planes and they were flying them and we were measuring the distances for a maths education course. And one of them said to me, Maria, what are we doing inside? We should be out there, it's a beautiful day. So we did, we went outside. So that was a little bit challenging because I hadn't thought of it. I hadn't thought of that idea. So we did go outside and it was a success, but sometimes this negotiated curriculum doesn't work too well. Excuse me. Now the next example I'll just mention is this great podcast. Now, taking away from the negotiated curriculum, if you're looking for ideas to make sure your research has impact, this is a really easy podcast to listen to by Mark Reed at the Newcastle University in the UK. And he gave a podcast, I think it was the end of last year, he uploaded a podcast. It's called Learning About Impact from Your Teaching, etc. And he works in the field, literally in the field, with farmers, gamekeepers, land carers. And he had this participatory research method that he wanted to use with these farmers. And he developed this method and he tested it out with his students in their class, in the classroom, in their tutorial. And it was a complete disaster. And it just didn't work. I don't know all the details, but he said it just was a real mess. And he said to his students, I'm in a bit of strife here. I've got to take this method out to the field, literally. In a few days' time, I've got all these farmers and land carers and gamekeepers lined up. And he said, I know it's not going to work. It didn't work with you, it's not going to work with them. So it was the last tutorial of the day, and apparently half of the class stayed back and said, we want to help you fix this thing. So they stayed back for half an hour or so, redesigned the participatory method that he was going to use. And then a few days later, Mark took it out to the field, used it, and it was a great success. So the next week in the tutorial, he took it back to the students and he said, look, thanks a lot for that. You really helped me. So they felt very valued, that they were engaged, involved, and it was a success. And one of the things he talks about, Mark Reed, he said you have to have this attitude of humility. You can't be going in thinking, I am the only one who knows this knowledge. You know, he's a collaborative learner, a social constructivist at heart. So, why do we bother? What I'd like to do now is launch a little bit into the theory. But just before I do, could I just ask you to take a moment and share with somebody next to you just what you're thinking at the moment about this whole negotiated curriculum thing. And think of it as almost a continuum, students in absolute control, you in absolute control at either end. So I'll just give you a few minutes. Would anyone like to share the sorts of things that you were talking about? Yeah, good point. And I think that's a fear that a lot of people have, which is fair enough, because you don't want to give the students so much power that they believe that they know more than you. And I've been in that situation and it's quite challenging. And but I think that it's the negotiated word that is the key word there. Any other comments that you were discussing and happy to share? So if you didn't hear that, what was your name, sorry? Shika said that her lecturer asked the students in the first class, to hack his website because he wanted to find out how you thought. Gosh, that's such a good idea, isn't it? It could be, you'd imagine it would be quite threatening for the lecturer. It's definitely that, and I've got an example in one of our research projects where the students' idea of teaching was lecturing. Pretty much that was it. So hardly any of my units have lectures anymore, so some of them think that I'm sitting back in my office with my feet up because I'm not lecturing. Yeah, some people are nodding. Does anyone else have that experience? And I think I've found more success with students that I know, that I've taught for a couple of years possibly, or at least I've taught before, or that they know me. And if I don't have that experience, I need to explain to them where I'm coming from. So that little metaphor I told you about the gym and the hotel? I tell that to all of my students. So they know that when they come into my units, they can't sit up the back on Facebook. They can't just look at the assignments in the unit outline. If they do, they don't go so well. And they get pretty cranky with me sometimes. But a lot of the negotiated curriculum, the benefit of it, I think, it's authentic engagement. So it's not just ticking the boxes. It's not just them going through saying, oh, what does she want in the rubric? Yeah, I'll do 10 references, I'll do this, I'll do that. It's not that. It's the exact opposite of that. But I really believe you have to warn them about this beforehand. So if they think they're coming in and they don't have to do any readings and they don't have to do the online activities or turn up to your classes, they'll be sorely mistaken. Any other comments that you came up with there? So true, isn't it? You have to be authentically engaged. There's a great Charlie Brown cartoon. I've been searching for it for years. If anyone finds it, please email it to me. But it's of Charlie Brown and the dog. What's the dog's name? Oh, yeah. And he's trying to teach Snoopy how to whistle. And there's all these little snippets of it. Has anyone seen it? And at the end of it, he said, but I taught him to whistle. Like, you can't whistle, of course, but the idea was I taught him, therefore he should learn. And I think some of our students' conceptions of learning and teaching are that they listen to us, we teach, we tell them, they listen. And at the Herzer conference recently, I heard this great phrase. Someone was talking about giving knowledge to the students and receiving it back unharmed. Don't you love that? That's exactly what this is not. I just love that idea. So I'm going to tell that to my students this semester. I don't want the knowledge back unharmed. I want it mixed around and reconstructed by you so that I can see you in it. I can see your voice and not just Maria's voice all the time. All right, thank you. Thanks for those contributions. What I'd just like to do now is flash a few things up on the screen about the theory or the why. And that it's a great quote by Lewin, I think it is, who said there's nothing as practical as a good theory. I just love, that's one of my favourite quotes. I think if we know why we're doing things, we can stand up tall and say to our vice-chancellors and our deans and our supervisors and so on, this is why I'm doing this. It might sound a bit weird, it might be a bit out of the box, but this is why I'm doing it. And here are some people who have done it before me and it's actually worked. So the ideas underneath the theory are many of the things that you just mentioned. Empowering students, ownership, not just token ticking the boxes, saying to students, tell me what you think about this, and not really listening. It's enabling them, giving them opportunities for buy-in, to get engaged with the curriculum, as Mark Reed did with his students. It involves a flatter hierarchy, so the lecturer-student relationship is flatter. So it's not exactly flat, but I think it's a lot flatter than possibly the way we've taught in the past. And underneath it all, as you can see by Becca here, the one in the middle, it's about higher levels of learning. So what he found in his research is that by engaging students in co-constructing rubrics, not just giving it to them before the semester starts to say, this is what I'll be using, but actually getting them involved, those students outperformed all the others. So I think there are some good research projects coming through at the moment, but of course we need more. Now, as a little bit of a scaffold, literally a scaffold, this ladder, Catherine Bovell and Catherine Bully from the University of Glasgow have developed this nice, neat little graphic model, and I would be more than happy to share this with my students, whether they were education students or not. I think they'd relate quite well to it. So at the very top, students in complete control. Now, I have to admit, I haven't done that. Does anybody know of any examples where that's been done? I'd love to know them if anyone comes across them. So this little ladder, I think, is quite a useful way to discuss this with our colleagues, with our students, with our managers and administrators. And as you can see, going up the ladder, the students become increasingly involved in participation. Hence the name of it, the ladder of student participation in curriculum design. And you could change curriculum design to assessment design or any other part of design you'd like to add there. Right, so now what I'd like to do is share with you 3 research projects that I've personally been involved in. 2 of them were funded by the Office for Learning and Teaching. Sadly, that's no longer there, the Office for Learning and Teaching. So I would like to acknowledge that funding. And the 3 projects, I'll just give you a moment to read the summary of them. So the first one was about a problem I had, and I solved it with my students by co-constructing a module within a unit. And by the way, when I use the word unit, just to translate my language, it's like a subject in a degree. Typically students are enrolled in 4 per semester at our college. The second one was where we did this thing, we called it ARAF, A-R-A-F. We had to do a Google search to make sure that didn't mean anything horrible in another language, but apparently we couldn't find anything, so we stuck with ARAF, and it stands for Adaptively Released Assessment Feedback Strategies. So these are examples of where you give feedback to students, but you don't give it to them all at once. It's like drip feeding. That's what the students told us it was like. And the last one was a big OLT project that we've just finished recently, where we engaged 6 cohorts of students at 3 higher education institutions with co-constructing the rubrics that they used. So the first one, this was my problem. This was back in 2012. I had this opportunity to go to this amazing place on the west coast of Ireland called Inishmaan. It's a little tiny island with about 140 people, 142 when my husband and I arrived. And it was such a beautiful place that you can see, I'll show you some pictures in a minute. There were no trees, it was super windy. If you think my hair's wild now, you should have seen it then. It was just a fantastic place to be. Now, I decided to go along to Inishmaan at the end of 2012. My husband at the time, he was writing a PhD and he was absolutely stuck and he just couldn't get going. And one of his relatives had been on the island 100 years before, which is why we went there, and he was a writer. And I said to Jack one day, wow, this would be great if you could come here and finish your PhD. And we just sort of went ha 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 and laughed for 5 minutes. And then I said, actually, why don't we just do it? So I went back to college and I spoke to my dean, and he said, look, if you can get all the units that you're teaching to be online by the beginning of next semester, yeah, go ahead. So I did. So my problem was, how am I going to teach an on-campus unit to a bunch of students, or part of this unit? How am I going to do it? So I knew I'd be a long way away. So in terms of the ladder of student participation, it was towards the top, and not exactly at the top, because I really was listening. I was trying to be a curriculum whisperer and listen to the students in terms of what they wanted and what they could have. So this was the situation. It was 1 unit, 2 lecturers. I was teaching just over half of the unit. And I sat down with the students 3 times in 2012, semester 2, and I said to them, we're going to plan this together. And out of, 42 students, 9 of them volunteered, which absolutely floored me. And this is one of the huge surprises for me in the negotiated curriculum. I'm always flummoxed by how many students get involved. So if you have that fear, they're not going to be interested. Think again, because sometimes they are. These students were really engaged. So they were all in Lake Macquarie, just north of Sydney, and I was over here thousands of miles away in Ireland. The internet over there was just fantastic. The internet was in a little thatched cottage. It was so cute, but it was actually better than the internet that I had back at home. So we went ahead, and that's Avondale, the college where I work at the moment. A beautiful campus, very small, and this is where I was. So you can see no trees. If you ever want to go to Inishmaan, it's just the most beautiful place. If you want to hear Irish spoken, Irish was the first language over there. Now, I was teaching over there online, obviously. I was, the only time I had an interruption was when on the island they were doing some electricity upgrades, and the interruption was when the students were having an online test, online exam, part of their unit. So we just moved the exam. I just told them what was going on. Now, by about Easter, when I was teaching these students, it was apparently very hot around Easter time in Lake Macquarie. And one of the students said to me, Maria, why are you wearing scarf and a jumper? It's so hot. And I said, I'm in Ireland. And he had no idea I was there. So for the first few months of the course, it made absolutely no difference as to where I was. So in terms of place-based teaching, it just didn't matter, which made me feel quite good, because I thought, well, all these worries I had about the internet working and the students getting annoyed with me because I wasn't in my office, they were laid to rest. So we found out from this little project, we wrote a paper for Ascalide called Hiccups, Realities and Lessons Learned. And I won't go through every single one of them. But look, if you're sick of listening to me for a while, just read the things and ignore what I'm about to say. But I'll just give you a little summary. The key word to all of this is with. So the key word is not me thinking, I think I know what the students need. It was talking to them and saying, if you were learning about X, Y, Z, what sorts of activities would help you? Like, I could give you a lecture, you could sit back and be a passive learner, or I could give you a few examples and ask you to comment on them according to these criteria. So we chose a lot of activities that were very active. So active activities, so that was their key phrase. Sounds so obvious, doesn't it? But they were very engaged with what they were doing, and some students liked that and some students didn't. So some students said, oh, this is such hard work. I have to do all these activities and I can't hide. Like, if they didn't do anything, I was onto them. I was sending them emails saying, dear Sally, looks like you haven't been onto Moodle for about 4 days. What's going on? Or not 4 days, probably, over a week or so. So they knew that they couldn't hide, and it was even if I didn't look how often they'd been on, it was really obvious if they weren't engaging in the materials. The other thing that I noticed, and we've already spoken about this, is this suspicion that they couldn't learn unless they were being lectured to. Now, this was back in 2013, and our students have undergone a change, I think, in that regard. And so I had to really help them to unpack the idea that you can still learn just by doing things. Even if they did more than I did, they would probably even be learning more. Now, these were some of the things that they said. I'll just let you have a read of those. The other thing that happens with the negotiated curriculum is that the students get an insight into what we do. And often they find that very, very interesting and revealing. Some groups of the students in one of the projects that I'll tell you about today, they said to me, I was an interviewer, and they said, Maria, do you know what? These lecturers, they work really hard. And the students didn't know I was a lecturer. I said, yeah, they do. I think they really do. And one of the students said, do you know what? They have to write a rubric for every assignment in this unit. I said, yeah, they do, yeah. And they said, and do you know what? They have to write a rubric for every unit, and sometimes they write 3 or 4 for a unit, and they have to teach more than one unit. And they were saying, how do they do all that? And I said, well, they're very tired. You know, they're very dedicated and they're tired. So give them a break when they don't get your assignment back to you, you know, within 5 minutes. So one of the students told us here that they really appreciated what we were doing. So they knew we were putting in a lot of work. Even though it was a negotiated curriculum with a flatter hierarchy, they appreciated the work we were doing. I think Bev, the other lecturer in the unit, summed it up really well. I'll just do a little bit of PowerPoint karaoke, you know, when you read the screen. I try not to do this too often. So the results so far confirmed what I've heard from the students. They are discovering that doing a module by distance puts them in control of their learning, and they're not sure they like having that responsibility. Also, they are discovering it takes a lot more brain power than merely being present in a lecture. So I was so excited to hear that, to be honest. I was happy to take some of the flack from the students if their learning, the quality of their learning increased. And if you'd like to read a little bit more about that, we published a paper at Ascolite in 2013. The second example, this is the one where we adaptively released the feedback that we handed to the students. So this was lower on the scale, on the ladder, I should say. And we were really interested in some work that I found about when I was back at Edith Cowan in the 90s. I don't know whether you remember, Grady, there was a visiting speaker from the Netherlands, I think, that Paul Newhouse got in. And he was talking about this idea of the impact of feedback on students' learning. And what they found, not just Butler, but others as well, I just found this fascinating, and the team I was working with found it really interesting, that giving students qualitative feedback, so words, you know, anecdotal comments, you know, when you type into their essays and so on, verbal feedback, that tended to impact their learning or their perception of themselves as a learner. So typically they would get these comments if they were specific, and they would change their learning or improve it. However, if they when they get quantitative feedback, these researchers found that it hit the students in the ego. So, you know, percentages, a grade, a rating out of 10 and so on. So the students would get the feedback, and if they got a high distinction, they'd think, oh, I'm so good, aren't I cool, aren't I amazing, I'm so smart. And then if they got a low mark, they would say, I'm an idiot, I'm hopeless, you know, I'm not worthy of being in this course, that sort of thing. So the idea was to split the two types of feedback up and give them out separately. So that's what we did in this project, and as someone said earlier, it was a lot of work. The other little tidbit of their research, they found that if we gave qualitative and quantitative feedback to the students together, the quantitative feedback trumped the qualitative. And look, so many people are just nodding at me now. Is that what happens with you? Does anybody want to comment on that phenomenon? They look at the mark and they're gone.
It's almost like you want to bring them in, give them the qualitative feedback, and then not allow them to see the mark until after they've moved through that step.
That's exactly what we did. Yeah, I'll tell you about it. Tom.
Well, I just put the summary of the feedback next to the mark. Otherwise,
Nice.
they won't turn the page to look at it.
Oh, that's a good way to go. So that is sort of strongly encouraging them to read that. And look, I have to admit, when I was in Ireland a few years ago, I was doing a course myself in family history, and it was a sort of a diploma thing, and it wasn't that strenuous, but I did the same thing. I got my results back, looked at the mark. So I'm guilty of that as well. But as you said, we split the feedback up in this project. So we got a little grant from the OLT, and in terms of the ladder, it's sort of on the bottom part of the ladder, I think. And this is for one assessment task in 3 different units, 2 undergraduate and 1 postgrad. So this is what we did. The students told us we were drip feeding them, which didn't have a really positive connotation. But what we did is we contacted the students and the lecturers, and first of all we evaluated their willingness to be involved. So if they were really anti this idea, we said, oh, let's choose another unit and another lecturer. So we ended up with 3 units. We got the lecturers to mark the students' work, so they weren't involved in the assessment design. We gave them the qualitative feedback, and then we paused and we collected some data from the students, and we said, how did you feel when you got the feedback? What did you do? What did you physically do? And some of them, one girl said she went into her room and just stared at the screen. She wanted to find out what she had done wrong. She looked at it on her phone and she went to the screen and had a look at her assignment. Another person said, I went and told Mum. I was so excited. I got a really good mark. It was much better than I expected. And so we asked them how they responded to the qualitative feedback. Then we waited a bit. We had a few problems with technology. Hopefully we've sorted that out now. And then we gave them their quantitative feedback and we asked them again, what did you do? What did you think? How did you feel? So we developed this kind of a conversation with the students as they went through excuse me, receiving their feedback. So these were our research processes. We did a pilot the year before, ironed out some of the problems. In stage 1, we identified the units and the students. We developed some strategies. And then we implemented the strategies, which was the giving them the feedback, getting their feedback to us and so on. And then we linked our findings up with other research. So in terms of recommendations, there were a lot, and the students had a lot to say. One of the biggest recommendations I wanted to mention today, though, is the difficulty if you delay the qualitative and quantitative feedback too much. And the students said they became quite anxious. Even the very confident ones, they said it was just too hard to wait. And it was beyond just being impatient. They said it's not just that they wanted the quantitative feedback. In fact, the whole project was called But Where Is My Mark? That was the project's name. So we kind of thought there was going to be some problems there. But one of the things that we found was very, very useful is to give them the qualitative feedback separately. So at least you're giving the qualitative feedback a chance, because we think that's the most important part of the feedback. We also coined this phrase, the meta phase of learning. So we called that the part of the learning process after they get the feedback, just after they got it. So if you think of the idea of a teachable moment, that was one of the things that we found was very important. There was this, it's like a missed opportunity in a lot of our courses at the moment, where something happens at the end there. It's really important. So we think that that could be explored further. And the feedback was especially useful if it was task or content specific. So us saying, great work, you might as well say nothing. You know, it doesn't really have much of an impact. And the other thing is the technology. You know, we experimented with all sorts of technology. Some worked, some didn't. This was a few years ago now, about 3 or 4 years ago. So I think our technology hopefully would be a bit better by now. So we wrote an article and we had a conference paper at the AARE conference in the beautiful Fremantle a few years back. And so if you're interested in finding out a bit more about that project, there you can have a look there. The last project I'd like to tell you about before I sum up with some recommendations is this project that we had funded by the OLT, and we wanted students to be engaged in rubric construction. And again, this is responding to Bowd's call, get students involved in the early stage of design. So in terms of the ladder, pretty close to the top, but not as close as right at the very top. So this was the project. I'll let you have a little read. So 6 cohorts of students, all undergraduate, 3 universities, one college, 2 universities, UTS, CSU and Avondale. And we had 5 different disciplines: nursing, can't remember them all, education, but we have 5 disciplines altogether. So this was our research design. We did a big literature review, a systematic lit review at the beginning with a Delphi approach, so we accessed a whole lot of experts around the world about assessment. And then we developed these effective rubric characteristics, which we published in our HERDSA 2017 paper. And then we got the students engaged in rubric construction. 5 of the 6 groups did that in the semester before the rubrics were used. And then we got them to use the rubrics. And during the co-construction and use period, we collected data. And then we developed a model, which I'll show you in a tick. So this was one of the original rubrics that one of the lecturers had. Now, do you remember my disaster where I gave them almost a blank rubric? This is a better way to do it. So this lecturer gave the students a lot of discussion about the fact that they'd be co-constructing. She gave them a partially finished one. Such a good strategy. Such a great strategy. I learnt that strategy from Jan Harrington, who's a great online teacher. I should have applied that earlier. So with this lecturer, that's the original one. The final one was this. Doesn't look too different, does it, from a rubric that you would expect to give? But most of the students, and this is really important, I think, the experts that we consulted didn't say this. Can you see this rubric? It starts on the left, high on the left, so HD, highly competent, whatever you want to call it, down to low. So most of our rubrics until this moment were the other way. So we have flipped all of them. The student said to us, do you think we're aiming for a fail? No, we were aiming for a high D, a high distinction. So put that over on the left. So that's one recommendation for practice we would suggest from this project. Now, in terms of the lecturers' reflections on this process, they were quite caught up with the idea of weightings of criteria. And look, the jury's still out as to whether you put numeric marks on those criteria. I feel really strongly that, and I don't. I give an overall, I tick boxes and use Turnitin and so on. But I don't anymore add marks to the rows of criteria. I don't think me as a human instrument, as a measurer, I think I'm too blunt, to put it that way. I don't think I can honestly say that I can delineate between giving a student 8.2 and 8.3. So if they came back and said, Maria, why did you give him 8.3 and him 8.2? I'd have to say I honestly don't know. But I'm pretty sure I could say, yes, it's definitely a distinction or it's definitely a credit. So that was one of the open-ended things that came out of the project. The other interesting thing is that we started to discuss this idea of a knockout criteria. And the nurses said to us, the nursing students and staff said, if the nursing students don't know the difference, say, between millilitres and litres, we don't care if they've got good referencing. We don't care if they've got a nice introduction to their essay. They're going to kill someone. So, and as a patient, I was a patient in hospital recently and I came out of the anaesthetic and I said to the student, where did you train? And he said, Avondale. I thought, oh, okay, this is putting the might to the metal, whatever that saying is. So I thought that's a really important idea, that knockout criteria. I'm still not sure exactly how it would work, but it's a good one to think about. Now, the students' perceptions. Incredibly positive. Again, we were shocked at this. Some of them were really interested in considering other people's opinions. Now, one group in particular weren't. They just wanted to, they were there for themselves. They wanted to find out the inside knowledge about the assignment, and they were completely open about that. They weren't there for altruistic reasons. And these are some of the comments. I'll read you one that I think sums up a lot of the project. We could criticise it, that's the rubric, or we could say good things about it, and it was like really helpful in terms of like our relationship with her. You can tell it's been transcribed. And the subject in general, and I think it really added to our approach of the subject. So they really got to understand what the lecturer was hoping that they would achieve. One group decided that they would have 2 rubrics, one for them, one for the students, an instructional rubric, and one for the lecturer. They called it a marking rubric. And they said to her, we don't really care what's in that one, as long as it doesn't clash with our one. So they wanted student language. And one of the things that they talked about was the little red text. And this was a group at UTS who were learning creative writing. And they kept drilling and drilling and drilling the lecturer to say, but what do you mean? We want to get an HD, what do you mean? And eventually she said, well, it has to be publishable. And they said, okay, put that in little red text. And then so they put little red text in all of the other rubrics, in all of the other cells of the rubric, because they got that. They understood all these words meant that one thing. The nurses said to us, sometimes you lecturers, you use all these words that we don't understand. And we said, well, tell us what they are and we'll replace them with your words. So one of them, believe it or not, was apply. I didn't get that. We know what that means. It's in Bloom's taxonomy. You know, most lecturers would know what that means. So we said, what should we use then? Use, they said. Just use the word use. Oh, okay, we can do that. So it was that sort of obvious type of comments. Some of them weren't so obvious, but a lot of them were. So out of that, we developed a model. It's not a framework because it won't cover everything for every situation. But the model had 3 levels. It looks a bit like a rubric, and the little bookmarks you have around you, you can access it on that website. The model, it has all the background information at the top level. It has the action processes in the middle and the research and the outcomes at the end. It looks like that. We asked our graphic designer to make it look rubric-y, if there's such a word. And so it's a bit like a smorgasbord. You can nip in and nip out and have a look at it. But one part I would encourage you to check out are the recommendations for practice. We have quite a few of them there, and they are at all different levels. So you can do a little bit, or you can go the full-blown negotiated curriculum. So we had a couple of articles and a paper, and a few more to come, I believe, going by what our team's doing at the moment. Now, I've shown you a lot of examples, suggested a lot of things. I'm going to play devil's advocate and say, why would you not do this? Because I'm not here to sell negotiated curriculum. I'm not here to say you have to do it, and I'll be sad if you don't. But there are some things that I think we need to be aware of, and some of you have mentioned some of these already. Quite a few of the students, when we interviewed them, said, how about equity? Like, is it fair that I'm getting the insider knowledge and all the other students are not getting it? And we said, oh, that's a good point. But we did open it up to all students in the unit, and only the ones who responded obviously were involved. And the other students, this is only anecdotally because I know some of the other students were quite happy to have people working on their behalf. So they were happy for those students to go along and meet with me or the other lecturers. And they could tell them, oh, make sure they don't do this and make sure they do this. So that was one of the things that we found. And as I said before, sometimes students have fantastic ideas and you think, why didn't I think of that? It was so obvious. And other times they just have really bad ideas, you know. Years ago when I worked in a primary school, we said to the students, we gave them a little survey and we said, we've got some money to buy some new sports equipment. And instead of us thinking, I think they'd like that, we actually said to the students, what would you like? And one of the comments was, we think, because we had a problem with footballs being kicked off into the bush, and one of the kids said, I think every person in the school should have their own football. And we said, oh, nice idea, but sorry about that. We'll have a bunch of footballs that we can share. So we had to, you know, I don't know who the student was, but we had to say we can't do everything. So I think you need to have a benchmark of what you're expecting. The other thing is that you have to know the curriculum really well. And this is the myth about negotiated curriculum. Some people think, oh, just wing it, just go in there and see what the kids are talking about that day and I'll just get on with it. No, it's the exact opposite. You really have to know the AQF, your learning outcomes from the unit, your course outcomes, because there will be some suggestions, and I found this when I was preparing the unit with the students when I went to Ireland. They said, oh, we could do this. And I said, yeah, but does that have anything to do with the unit? Oh, no, it doesn't. Okay, so we won't do that. The other thing that they did, they created this really complicated assignment that would have taken, about 10,000 words. And I said, look, by our assessment policy, I can only use, I think it was 2,000 words. So they had to cut back. So they're actually going higher than what I expected them to go. And I also said, I'm not marking that thing. It's going to take me too long. And they said, oh, okay, we have to think about you as well. So they were some of the things that I would say consider, and also share with them your conceptions of teaching and learning. Now, I've borrowed here from, is it Martin and Kemba, some great scholars in the field of teaching and learning. And you can see that on the one on the left, the conceptions of learning, if you've got a conception of learning that is increasing one's knowledge and letting students soak up the knowledge that you have, the negotiated curriculum might make you feel quite uneasy. But if you're someone who has an idea of teaching and learning that's more negotiated, your conception of knowledge is not just coming down from a big authority, then you're going to feel more comfortable with it. That's one side of the coin, of course. We've also got our students. And a lot of my students a few years back, they really did believe teaching is lecturing, learning is listening. And therefore, if you're not lecturing to me, you're not really doing your job. So I think I had to talk to them about social constructivist learning. These were education students. I was really shocked. I thought we had taught them that, like Charlie Brown taught Snoopy. But anyway, we hadn't really taught that. So I think it comes back to, dare I say, a really good practical theory. So if you have more open ideas of knowledge, or even if you have an idea of learning or teaching that is in the middle of those, push yourself to a little bit more and try a little bit of negotiated curriculum. So a few summed up recommendations for practice. You probably have all heard of this statement before by Schul, and one of Biggs and Tang's books is about what the student does is more important than what the teacher does. Now, I think this was really important for the higher education sector to hear, maybe especially 15, 20 years ago, when we, as a sector, I think we did think that scheduling a unit or a course meant scheduling lectures. Now, just by this very space today, we know that's not the case anymore. Mind you, there's nothing wrong with a really good lecture. I think that can be motivating for our students as well. So Schul says it's helpful for us to remember that it's way more important in terms of what the student does. Now, I'd like to balance that a little bit with Hattie's work. So we had this book from Biggs and Tang, really important what the student does. Then we've got this one recently from John Hattie, who says make learning visible. And you know, there is a balance there, I think. So obviously learning is really important, what the students do. But Hattie told us, he did this huge meta-analysis of, I don't know, thousands of articles about teaching and learning, and he wanted to find out what is the main thing that influences learning. Blow me down, it's teaching. You know, so if you've got good quality teaching, then of course the learning will be increased. The Finns, a lot of people in Scandinavia have known this for a long time. They put a lot of money into teacher education because they know this. So John Hattie put it in a nice few books for us, and I think it just balances up the idea what the students do that's very, very important, but we can influence that as good teachers. So in terms of practical applications, one thing I would really encourage you to do is to discuss this with your students. Even if you just discuss with them how you could do something. You know, say to them, I've planned these 3 case studies to talk to you about this particular area of your learning. At the end of today, I just want you to tell me which of these case studies really related to you, and if I did this lesson again or this tute again, how could I change things? Or get them to contribute the case studies. Ask them a few weeks before. Look for a case study or an example in your field of study that shows me this, this and this. One lecturer I spoke to, she was at UWA, she used to ask her students to bring in a song that showed how they cared for their patients. You know, I think it was physiotherapy or something. So that really gave her an insight into how they saw their patients. A really interesting activity too. I think with the idea of making your planning visible, so taking Hattie's idea of making learning visible, I really like the idea. You don't want to bore students silly, you know, with an hour telling them how you've planned this lecture and how good it is and everything. But I think it's really important to say, look, I designed this activity you're going to be doing this, this and this, and I expect you at this level of the activity at this point to maybe 10 minutes in, you're probably going to find that really hard. And don't worry, everyone will find that difficult. So sort of warn them about what will be coming up. And I think that's something we can do in the negotiated curriculum. And on that little bookmark I've given you, which comes from our Owning the Rubric project, there's a section in there called Recommendations for Practice. So if you're feeling like you'd love to go out and have a go at this negotiated curriculum, there are some examples there of what you could do before the semester starts, how to prepare the students, a few little ideas of what you could do if you just want to try it, just put your toe in the water. So a couple of years ago, I had a rubric that I thought was pretty good. I'd spent a lot of time on it, and I'd been through most of the project by that stage, and I thought, I think this is a good rubric. And I sent it out to my students a couple of weeks before the semester started. Now, out of about 50 of them, I think 4 or 5 responded. So I thought that was, reasonable because they're on holidays. So that's one thing you could do if your institution's quality assurance processes allows that. So in conclusion, 3 little messages to take away. I would just encourage you to try a little bit of this or a lot. And the website that I just told you about will give you some ideas there. Your colleagues and your students will have great ideas as well to bring in ideas to help them to get engaged in curriculum design and assessment design. The other thing is to extend your idea of how you could do this. So we used online discussion forums, email, chat. We had a Facebook page at one stage that the students developed. So I walked into a lecture one day this is quite a long time ago now, when I did do lectures, and I said to one of the students who was sitting there, I said, I need to create a Facebook group. I don't know how to do it. And honestly, by the time I'd almost finished my sentence, he'd done it. So I thought, that was so easy. I thought I'd have to go onto YouTube, find out how to do it, ring up my nieces, and no, this guy just did it, in a matter of seconds. So sometimes I think when we ask the questions of our students, it actually works. And the last thing is to really genuinely be a curriculum whisperer. So listening in partnership with your students. So that feeling in the group, even in an online group, and you think, they're not happy, something's really not wrong here, not right here, and I don't know what it is. I think we have to be brave and just ask the question, what's going on with you? What would make this better? Is there anything I can do to make this better without stepping into your zone? A few years ago, I had a bunch of students who were very, very, very needy, and I wanted them to be very, very, very independent, and I had this problem. So I brought in, it was an on-campus class, I brought in the biggest spoon I could find in my kitchen, and I brought in the smallest spoon, and I said, look, you're asking me to do the big spoon feeding, and I want to use the little one. I want you to be really independent and go out and make decisions on your own. And they said, is that why you do that blah, blah, blah thing? Yes, that's right. So I think I'm talking to myself here as well. I could do this more often and just share these ideas with my students. So I hope you enjoy your curriculum whispering in the future, and I hope you can take a couple of examples here with you today. Thank you. Do we have any questions or comments or stories? Yeah, so the question is, if you're teaching somebody who is skilled in Japanese speaking, a Japanese speaker, and you're trying to teach them English, could this work? Okay, I'm going to do a bit of a negotiated curricula here and ask you, how do you think that could work? I don't actually know. So does anybody have any ideas of how that could work? Yeah, look, I have no clue about how to do that. I don't have that background, but what I would, if I was in a brainstorming group, I would suggest maybe using Japanese to explain that first and then gradually pull back and use that scaffolding idea where you bring English in sort of as an immersive thing. I don't know. That's just what I would think as someone who went to Ireland and had to learn how to speak Irish. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, the key word was willingness. So we interviewed a few different lecturers and their students, and in one group I remember there was a lot of arm folding, so I was like, we're not doing this. And we thought, no, we're not doing that group. There were others where they said, this is quite interesting. And they started asking questions. So we thought that could be a good group. So that was a great question. That was their willingness of the lecturers and the students.
Would there be any chance that you could, like, I don't know, do you have some ideas where you could sort of involve that negotiation as a part of the lessons?
Yeah, I think that we'd do that next time if we did it again. So because some of the students, although we said this is what's going to be happening, I don't think we were explicit enough. So that anxiety could be reduced a bit. And even if we said to them, other students have found this a bit anxiety making. So just be aware, and we'll do everything we can in our power to reduce that for you. Yeah, look, one of the lecturers had that idea and she really wanted to do that. But in our assessment policy, we're not allowed to do that. So it's another example. Someone mentioned Q&A issues. We had to fit it in within policy, and we also had to get it through ethics committee and the teaching and learning committee. So, and I think some universities have the resubmission policy in first year or first semester. Nice, yeah. When we actually asked the students, how are you going to use this in the future? And some of them did mention that they'd even apply their learning or use their learning, to use their language, in another unit. So that was, that's a good idea. Especially if there's a link. Very satisfying for a lecturer too. Which is really what you want, isn't it? You want them to use the feedback and you want them to read it first and use it second. Yeah, that's a good point. And I think we do this almost naturally in the postgraduate area. You know, we're a lot more negotiated with our HDR students. Sure, I've got a couple. One of them I'm going to borrow from Tattle, a Tattle activity. And what we did early in the piece, thanks to Robert and Coralie, they encouraged us to explain our conception of learning with a metaphor. You know, so we explored metaphors, and I've seen other people do this with objects. You know, they bring an object in, and they say, you know, this is what I think teaching is, filling up a bottle of, filling up a person with knowledge or something. So that could be one thing that you could do to explore with the students. And I think the other thing is to be pretty open with them about recent research. You know, I haven't found many articles recently on high quality teaching that say you have to just talk at the lecture like I've been doing to you today, but that you just talk at them without any questions and without any engagement and without thinking of their experiences. So I think to get the students to understand, they actually learn better when they do something. And one of the questions that we often ask our students is, what have you learned recently? And one of them said, I got a new mobile phone and I had to work out how to use that. So how did you learn that? Did you go to a lecture? No. Did you go to a textbook and answer questions? No. What did you do? I went onto YouTube, I asked my brother, he's really good, he's a techie, all these sorts. So they consulted experts, they did activities, they tried it, they made lots of mistakes. So I think if you get students to understand what good learning is, then you'll have an easier time. All right, well, we might leave it there at that stage. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Marie. I think that was really, really interesting. I definitely do remember that presentation and talk about the feedback and whether we give it quantitatively or qualitatively. It's really fantastic research. I'd also like to give a call out to John Minns, one of our distinguished educators, who's been doing a little bit of this in our university, and we have a policy exemption policy, which enables people to do things a bit differently if they want to try it. So if you want to try something different and you think it's outside the policy, just let us know and we can enable you to do something really different and to get the students involved. And certainly I know John Minns has been getting the students to make choices about what the topics for each class are and also negotiating the type of assessment that they might do. And so he's an expert within our university who might enable you to enact some of the things that Maria's been talking about. So I have a gift for Maria.
Thank you so much.
And it gives me great pleasure to give the gift to her. And please join me in thanking her again for her keynote speech.
Thanks so much.